I need to admit something about my job. For 8 years, I've built the economic models that are supposed to prove conservation pays that a living ecosystem, priced correctly, beats whatever you could extract from it instead. I work in natural capital economics in Washington, D.C., which mostly means I build the spreadsheets and reports that convince skeptical funders, governments, and landowners that protecting a wetland or a reef is a better long-term financial bet than draining it, logging it, or grazing cattle across it. I do believe the work matters. Even now, I've watched it change real funding decisions more than once, watched a persuasive enough model move a genuinely reluctant landowner toward a conservation easement they'd rejected outright a year earlier. I've also spent most of those 8 years at a comfortable distance from the actual moment where that math either holds or doesn't, the specific day, the specific decision, the specific person standing there having to act on the number rather than just calculate it. Then my friend Marina called me about a river. Marina Duarte and I met in graduate school, in the same environmental economics program, back when we were both certain we'd end up doing roughly the same kind of work in roughly the same kind of city. She went a different direction after finishing her degree, leaving a finance career in Sao Paulo to run a river conservation cooperative near Bonito, a small town in Brazil's Mato Grosso do Sul state that had become, over the past few decades, one of the more genuinely remarkable case studies in my own field, a place where crystal-clear spring-fed rivers had become worth more to the local economy, provably, in real revenue terms, than the cattle ranching that used to dominate the same land. I'd cited Bonito in more slide decks than I could count without actually visiting it, footnoted to the same handful of papers everyone in my field cites, none of us having actually stood at the water ourselves. Marina called one evening, sounding more urgent than her usual professional check-ins, and asked if I'd finally come see the place in person, not for a conference, not for a report, but because she wanted me to watch something happen that she didn't think I'd fully understand from a case study summary. I asked what, specifically, she wanted me to see, half expecting a technical answer about turbidity readings or visitor statistics. She told me, a little cryptically, that she wanted me to watch someone turn away money. I booked a flight 2 weeks later. I told my firm I was doing field research for an upcoming natural capital report, which was true, and left out how little I actually understood about what that research was going to ask of me personally. I'd spent years telling other people that protecting a resource sometimes means walking away from short-term revenue for the sake of long-term value. I had never once had to be the person actually doing the walking away, in real time, with a specific dollar figure attached and a specific disappointed customer standing in front of me. On the long flight south, I found myself rereading my own most cited slide, the one comparing Bonito's tourism revenue to its historical cattle output, and noticing, for what felt like the first time, that the slide had never once had to specify who, exactly, was standing at the water making sure the underlying number stayed true on any given Tuesday. Bonito meets you as a small, unassuming town built around a single main street, souvenir shops and tour agency storefronts doing most of the visible business. Nothing about the town itself suggesting the specific, almost surgical precision of what happens in the rivers just outside it. Marina picked me up from the regional airport and drove us straight to one of her cooperative's monitoring sites before we'd even properly caught up, clearly eager to get the actual demonstration in front of me before the conversation, apologizing halfway through the drive for skipping the usual pleasantries. The rivers around Bonito run through karst, limestone terrain, and that geology does something almost unbelievable to the water passing through it. As rain and groundwater move through the limestone soil, dissolved minerals bind to organic sediment and pull it out of suspension, functioning as an enormous, continuous natural filter. The result, in the clearest stretches, is water so transparent that a coin dropped 6 meters down remains perfectly legible from the surface. Schools of Pyraputanga fish appearing to hover in empty space rather than swim through anything resembling ordinary river water. Standing at the edge of one spring-fed channel that first afternoon, watching light move through water with almost no visible medium to interrupt it, I understood immediately why an entire regional economy had reorganized itself around protecting this one specific, fragile property. A guide floating nearby with another group pointed out a fish drifting past, close enough to touch, and for a strange moment I genuinely couldn't tell, from the surface, whether the water was there at all. What I hadn't fully understood, walking in with my case study version of the story, was how deliberately engineered the protection actually is. Access to the rivers runs entirely through licensed tour operators, daily visitor numbers capped per site, entry vouchers issued exclusively through agencies rather than sold at the water's edge, revenue distributed by agreement among landowners, the municipality, and the state. None of this happened because a government agency mandated it from above. It happened because local landowners, watching cattle ranching produce a fraction of what Clearwater tourism could generate on the same acreage, organized themselves into exactly the kind of voluntary, self-enforced conservation economy. My field spends most of its time trying to theoretically justify on paper. Bonito had already run the experiment I usually only model. Marina walked me through the numbers over dinner that first night, and I found myself doing the thing I do at work without meaning to, translating her descriptions into the kind of clean, net present value comparison I'd build for a funding report. Cattle revenue per acre against tourism revenue per acre, discounted appropriately, risk adjusted for drought years and bad tourism seasons. She let me get about halfway through before stopping me, setting her fork down with the specific deliberateness of someone about to make a point she'd clearly made before. The actual mechanism holding the system together, she said, wasn't the comparison itself. It was the fact that dozens of individual landowners and guides had to keep choosing, personally, on ordinary days when nobody was measuring anything, to protect a shared resource that any one of them could quietly degrade for short-term personal gain without immediate consequence. My models treat that kind of choice as a solved incentive alignment problem once the comparative numbers are clear enough. Marina wanted me to understand that it doesn't actually stay solved. It has to be re-chosen by specific people on specific days, indefinitely. I was wrong about something sitting in that restaurant. I'd assumed, for years, that once you've built a sufficiently persuasive economic case for conservation, the hard intellectual work is essentially finished, the incentives are aligned, the number proves the point, and compliance follows more or less automatically from self-interest. What Marina was describing was closer to an ongoing, unfinished negotiation, one that required someone, regularly, to act against their own immediate financial interest in the name of a long-term average their own household budget couldn't always afford to wait for. The next morning, before we went anywhere near the water again, Marina took me a few hours north, toward the edge of the Pantanal, the vast seasonal wetland covering an area larger than several U.S. states, roughly 70% of it vanishing beneath floodwater for half of every year. During the wet season, the basin functions as an enormous natural sponge, absorbing runoff from surrounding highlands until water sits several meters deep across land that had been dry savanna months before, forcing every species living there to adapt or relocate. Capybaras crowd onto shrinking dryland islands during the deepest floods, sometimes dozens of them packed together in spaces that would comfortably hold a fraction of that number in a normal season. Jaguars here have developed a genuinely unusual hunting strategy as a direct result of that same flooding, rather than avoiding deep water the way most cats do. Pantanal jaguars swim, targeting caimans and capybaras crowded onto those same shrinking islands, an animal weighing up to 90 kilograms taking down prey nearly as large through the flooded current, rather than from dry land. For generations, local ranchers treated jaguars purely as a threat to livestock, worth killing on sight, a stance Marina told me was still openly defended in some parts of the region even now. She told me the calculation has flipped completely though. In the more organized ecotourism zones, a single living jaguar, tracked and photographed by tour groups, paying specifically for the chance to see one, now generates more revenue over its lifetime than the cattle that same territory could have supported. It's the exact statistic I'd used in slide decks for years, and standing at the edge of a flooded plain watching a heron pick through shallow water where cattle used to graze, I understood, for the first time, how much weight that single sentence was actually carrying. We stopped, on the drive back, at a place called Barranco das Araras, a massive sinkhole roughly 100 meters deep and 160 meters across, its vertical walls now home to hundreds of red and green macaws that nest on ledges too inaccessible for most predators to reach, their calls echoing off the orange stone with an intensity that seemed to physically vibrate the air around the rim. For decades, this same pit had served as an informal local dump, filled with abandoned vehicles and waste, a dead space in the middle of scrubland nobody thought twice about. A private landowner eventually paid to have it cleared, hauling out years of accumulated debris simply because the site was on their property and they decided it was worth the cost, with no government mandate and no immediate financial return attached to the decision at the time. The macaws returned on their own, unprompted, once the space was simply clean enough to be worth returning to. Marina pointed out that this was probably the least economically rational conservation story of the entire trip. By my own field's usual standards, a private individual spending real money with no guaranteed payoff, based on something closer to a personal conviction that the pit deserved to be something other than a dump. I didn't have a clean model for that kind of decision. I still don't, honestly, though I've caught myself trying to build one more than once since. The day everything actually came into sharp focus happened on my fourth day, back at one of the main river sites outside Bonito, where Marina had arranged for me to shadow a guide named Rafael Souza on a full-day tour. Rafael has worked the rivers around Bonito for 11 years, licensed and certified through the same regional system that caps daily visitor numbers, and clearly took a specific, quiet pride in the exact condition of the stretch of water he guided most often. He'd grown up nearby, he told me while we waited for the group to arrive. On land, his own family had once grazed cattle across before switching, like most of their neighbors, to the tourism economy sometime in his childhood. He didn't romanticize the transition. He simply said it had been the more reliable income, and that the river, unlike a herd, didn't get sick or need to be sold off during a bad year, as long as everyone kept treating it the way it needed to be treated. The group that day was a family of 11, 3 generations traveling together, who had paid in full weeks in advance for a snorkeling tour along one of the clearest sections of river in the region. The morning started exactly the way Marina had described dozens of times in our earlier conversations. Water so transparent the fish appeared to hang suspended in open air. The family audibly thrilled, cameras out, kids shrieking with delight at fish brushing past their legs. About 40 minutes in, a storm that had been building over the hills upstream finally broke, dumping heavy rain outside the immediate valley we were floating through, thunder audible in the distance, but the sky directly above us still mostly clear. Rafael noticed the change in the water before any of us did. A subtle shift in color and texture at the edge of his vision that he later described as something he'd learned to recognize the way you recognize a change in a familiar person's tone of voice, long before you could point to any single word that gave it away. Within about 10 minutes, the river's transparency had measurably degraded, sediment carried down from the storm-fed tributaries, beginning to cloud water that, an hour earlier, had been effectively invisible. He had a decision in front of him with no comfortable version. The family in the water with him had paid in full for a specific, promised experience, one they'd traveled a significant distance and spent real money to have. And the degraded water, while still perfectly pleasant by most ordinary standards, was no longer the extraordinary, glass-clear river Bonito's entire reputation and pricing structure depended on. Cutting the tour short and refunding a portion of the fee would cost Rafael and his family real income for that day, income he couldn't fully recover elsewhere on short notice. Letting the tour continue at full length and full price risked something harder to quantify, but in Marina's cooperative's collective judgment, more damaging over time, allowing a paying customer to experience and photograph Bonito's water at anything less than its full, famous clarity, diluting, one visitor at a time. the very specific reputation the entire regional economy had spent decades building. I watched him make the call in something close to real time, checking the water against a small laminated reference card he carried specifically for exactly this judgment, holding it just beneath the surface and comparing the visible gradient against the printed swatches, then gathering the family at the surface and explaining, calmly and without much drama, that conditions had changed and that he was ending the tour roughly 20 minutes early, offering a partial refund on the spot rather than waiting for a formal complaint process to force the issue later. The family's initial disappointment was visible and, I thought, completely understandable. One of the teenagers audibly groaned, and the grandmother asked, not unkindly, whether they could just wait 10 minutes to see if it cleared back up. Raphael didn't argue with their reaction and didn't pretend the disappointment wasn't reasonable. He simply held the decision, walked them back to the access point, and processed the partial refund himself, out of his own day's earnings, before the boat had even finished being secured. I was wrong about something specific, watching that unfold. I'd assumed, walking into that morning, that conservation-aligned economics meant the hard choices had mostly already been made upstream, encoded into pricing structures and visitor caps that individual guides simply executed on autopilot. What I actually watched was a specific person absorbing a specific, immediate financial loss in front of a disappointed family based on a threshold nobody was going to enforce on him in that exact moment if he'd simply chosen to look away. Nobody was standing over his shoulder that morning, verifying his water clarity judgment. He made the call because the entire economic system he belonged to only continued working if people who could have quietly cut corners kept choosing not to, one ordinary, unglamorous morning at a time. Raphael told Marina and me over a late lunch that this wasn't a rare occurrence, more like something that happened a handful of times each rainy season, and that the cooperative had discussed, more than once, building a more formal instrument-based threshold to remove the subjectivity from the call entirely. He was, somewhat to my surprise, ambivalent about that idea. An instrument, he said, can tell you a number. It can't yet tell you the specific texture of a river a guide has spent 11 years learning to read, and he wasn't fully convinced a formal threshold would actually make better decisions than the ones he was already making by feel, even on days when getting it wrong would have been easier and more profitable than getting it right. He also mentioned, almost as an aside, that the family he'd refunded that morning had left him a generous tip anyway, along with a note thanking him for being honest with them rather than letting them believe they'd seen the real river at anything less than its best. Once that day's tension had settled, Marina had a handful of days left before my flight home, and she used them, deliberately, to show me how far this same underlying tension extended across the rest of the country, not as a detour from Bonito's lesson, but as the scale it actually belonged to. On the way east, we made a brief stop along Costa dos Corais, a living limestone reef stretching well over 100 kilometers along the northeastern coastline, built by billions of tiny organisms over thousands of years into a natural barrier absorbing the worst of the open Atlantic before it ever reaches shore. Manatees still move through the reef's deeper channels, animals weighing up to 600 kilograms, drifting at barely walking pace. Hunted to near extinction in the region by the mid-20th century and now numbering fewer than 500 individuals in these specific waters, Marina told me the reef itself functions less like scenery and more like unpaid infrastructure, its structure absorbing wave energy that would otherwise erode the coastline directly. Its seagrass beds, each manatee eating roughly 25 kilograms of seagrass a day just to maintain body heat, surviving only because the reef breaks the waves that would otherwise tear the grass apart. Rising ocean temperatures and agricultural runoff from nearby sugarcane plantations now threaten the same coral responsible for holding all of it together, an invisible risk replacing what colonial-era sailors once treated as a purely physical, visible hazard to their ships. We flew east to Fernando de Noronha, a volcanic archipelago sitting far off the mainland coast, 21 islands formed by an ancient underwater eruption. For nearly 2 centuries, the main island served as a Brazilian penal colony. Prisoners sent hundreds of kilometers from the mainland to a place where sheer volcanic cliffs functioned as natural, inescapable walls. That same isolation, which once made the island valuable specifically as a prison, has made it, since the colony's closure, one of the most pristine marine ecosystems in the South Atlantic. Resident dolphin populations numbering in the thousands, gathering in the same sheltered bay most mornings to rest after a night of hunting in open water. Coral formations largely undisturbed by the kind of coastal development that reshaped most of the mainland's shoreline. Access today is tightly restricted. A daily environmental tax that increases the longer any visitor stays. A strict cap on how many people can be on the main island at any given time. Standing near the ruins of the old prison cells, now surrounded by nesting sea turtles and vegetation that had reclaimed the ground within a few decades of the colony's closure, I thought about how strange it was that the exact geographic property that once defined a life sentence total, inescapable isolation had become, under a different set of incentives, the precise thing now being protected at real financial cost to make sure it never opens back up in the way that would ruin it. Further west, in Maranhão State, Marina took me to the Lençóis Maranhenses, a vast field of white quartz sand dunes that from a distance looks like a sterile desert incapable of supporting anything at all. The region receives nearly 1.25 meters of rain annually, a volume that would surprise anyone who only knows it from postcard photos of bare white dunes. During the rainy season, water becomes trapped between the dunes by an impermeable layer of rock beneath the sand, forming thousands of temporary freshwater lagoons and landscape depressions that had been bone dry a month earlier. Certain fish species, most notably South American lungfish, survive the dry months buried in damp mud beneath the sand in a state of dormancy, emerging once the rains return to hunt and breed in lagoons that didn't exist a few weeks before. Local fishing families have adapted their entire seasonal rhythm around this cycle for generations, harvesting fish from the middle of what looks, for half the year, like an uninhabitable desert. Marina pointed out that the entire system depends on an underground water table sitting just below the surface, invisible and essentially unmonitored by anyone outside a small circle of local researchers, the same basic pattern as Bonito's rivers, just with the critical mechanism buried instead of flowing in plain sight. We flew south briefly to Jalapão, one of the most isolated regions in the country, fewer than 1 person per square mile across roughly 90,000 square kilometers of orange dune-covered savanna. The color coming from iron oxide within sandstone formations eroded over millions of years. Scattered through the region are natural springs called fervaduros, circular pools fed by high-pressure underground aquifers, pushing up through fine white sand with enough force that a person jumping in simply cannot sink, and even a thrown stone gets forced back toward the surface. Geologists studying these wells still don't have a complete picture of the aquifer system feeding them, and the entire phenomenon depends on underground pressure nobody can directly observe or fully quantify holding steady indefinitely for reasons not entirely understood even by the people who study it closely. Standing at the edge of one spring, watching a stick I'd tossed in get pushed steadily back toward the surface, against every instinct I had about how gravity should behave, I thought about how much of what we'd seen all week ultimately rested on exactly this kind of invisible, barely measured mechanism, holding quietly, without anyone fully able to guarantee that it would keep doing so. On my second to last day, we flew north toward the point where Brazil, Venezuela, and Guyana meet, to see Mount Roraima from a distance, a massive sandstone plateau rising nearly 3,000 meters, its vertical walls dropping almost straight down for the final stretch. The summit itself essentially unreachable without serious technical climbing. The formation has remained largely unchanged for roughly 2 billion years. Isolated long enough by its sheer cliffs that early European explorers' accounts of the summit's strange cut-off ecosystem helped inspire the popular idea of a literal lost world where time had simply stopped. Small black toads living at the summit have, over that isolation, lost the ability to jump entirely. An evolutionary response to millions of years spent on a plateau with no predators requiring rapid escape. surviving on a nearly soil-free surface where rain has worn the exposed black rock into shapes that look almost architectural. Marina told me the mountain gets cited constantly in conservation literature as the ultimate symbol of untouched permanence, and that the label always struck her as slightly misleading. The plateau hasn't survived because nothing has ever threatened it, but because its geography made threatening it functionally impossible for nearly the entirety of human history. A form of protection that had nothing to do with anyone's economic model at all. On my last full day, we stopped in Ouro Preto, a colonial mining town in Minas Gerais that produced, over roughly a century, more gold than the entirety of Spain's American colonies combined. The wealth extracted from tunnels beneath the town funded churches whose interiors are still covered floor to ceiling in gold leaf, an entire local economy built on labor, performed by enslaved people in conditions the tour materials didn't shy away from describing honestly. Marina walked me through one of the old mining tunnels, narrow enough that we had to crouch the entire way, cold, damp air smelling faintly of iron, and told me the ore here was historically called black gold, coated in iron oxide that hid its true value from the untrained eye of the workers extracting it, meaning a fortune could pass through a person's hands looking like ordinary dark stone. The entire town, she said, now survives economically on tourism built around the very history of extraction that once nearly destroyed it. A transition not unlike Bonito's, except built on top of an industry that had already finished taking everything it could before anyone thought to protect what remained. I flew home 2 days later. Marina stayed. Obviously, her work is there, in a way that made far more sense to me, having spent 2 weeks standing inside it than it ever had reading her reports from Washington. We talk more since the trip than we did before it, usually circling back, in one form or another, to some version of the same question neither of us has fully resolved. How much of what I'd call a solved incentive problem in my own reports is actually just a decision someone, somewhere, is quietly still remaking every single day? She emailed me about 6 weeks after I'd landed back in DC with an update from Rafael. The cooperative had ultimately decided against installing a fully automated turbidity threshold, choosing instead to formalize guide judgment as an official, protected part of the protocol guides empowered, explicitly and on the record, to cut a tour short based on direct observation, with the cooperative absorbing part of the refund cost collectively rather than leaving individual guides to bear it alone. Rafael had told her, in the same understated tone he'd used with both of us that afternoon, that he thought the change made the system slightly more honest about what it actually was. Not a clean, self-executing economic model, but a group of specific people agreeing, out loud, to keep making the harder call together. Marina added, almost as a closing note, that the cooperative's board had voted on the policy unanimously, which she said mattered to her more than the specific mechanism they'd landed on. Proof, in her mind, that the group had actually absorbed the lesson rather than just outsourced it to a censor. I don't think the lesson I took from that trip is really about rivers, not only. It's about how easily my own field had trained me to treat a well-built economic case as the finish line, rather than the opening argument for a negotiation that has to keep happening, in person, indefinitely, long after the report gets published and the funding gets approved. The number that proves jaguars are worth more than cattle doesn't protect a single jaguar on its own. It just makes the case over and over to the next person standing at the edge of the water deciding whether today is the day they choose to believe it. A model can tell a funder that conservation pays. It can't yet make the specific guide, on the specific rainy morning, actually walk his paying customers back to shore. What stays with me most isn't the scale of any single site, honestly not the size of the Pantanal, not the age of Roraima's plateau, not even the specific dollar figure of Rafael's refund that afternoon. It's the image of him checking that laminated card against water only he could see clearly enough to judge, choosing to act against his own immediate interest before anyone forced him to, because the entire system he belonged to only worked if people kept doing exactly that. On ordinary days, when nobody besides the river itself was watching closely enough to know the difference, I think about every report I've written that treated an aligned incentive as a permanent, solved condition rather than a daily renewal, and how many of those reports I'd probably write differently now, with a little more honesty about how much ongoing, unglamorous, individual choice actually sits underneath the clean number on the final page. A short breath before I let you go. If this story changed how you think about what a conservation success story actually requires day to day, I'd genuinely like to know which part of it stayed with you. Because somewhere on a Brazilian river right now, a guide is checking the water against his own memory of how clear it's supposed to be, deciding, quietly, whether today is a day worth the cost of getting it right. The same decision Raphael made, the same decision someone will make again next week, and the week after that, for as long as the arrangement holds. How many of the economic success stories we cite as settled are actually still being paid for, in small, unrecorded amounts, by specific people choosing not to take the easier option today, quietly, without anyone outside the immediate moment ever finding out how close it came to going the other way? This narrative is told through the perspective of Elena Cross, a fictional natural capital economist, and includes the fictional composite characters Marina Duarte and Rafael Souza. The ecological, economic, and historical details of Brazil described here, including Bonito's licensed visitor cap tourism model, the Pantanal's jaguar-based ecotourism economics, and the restoration of Buraco das Araras, are real and presented as accurately as possible at the time of writing. The specific tour, water clarity incident, and refund decision described in this script are a fictionalized composite, not a documented real event.